I never imagined the son I raised with my own hands could turn into a stranger who stole my dignity and emptied my savings. Last week, I sat alone in my dimly lit apartment on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, clutching an empty bank statement, the silence heavier than any night I'd ever known. The numbers on that paper told a story I refused to believe. Today, I'm going to tell you something I never thought I would share. And if for even a second this feels familiar, I only ask that you like this video and subscribe. It will help me keep opening my heart. My name is Eleanor, and at 72 years old, I thought I knew everything about betrayal. I was wrong. Every morning begins the same way in my small studio apartment. The radiator clanks to life at 5:30, and I shuffle across the cold hardwood floor in my worn slippers, the ones Michael bought me 3 Christmas ago when he still remembered I existed. The coffee maker gurgles as Manhattan awakens below my 4th-floor window, yellow taxis honking their way through another day, while I stand there in my faded blue robe, waiting for a phone that never rings. The routine has become my prison. I brew my coffee in the same chipped mug, the one with "World's Best Mom" painted in letters that have faded to barely visible whispers. I sit at my small kitchen table, the one Michael helped me move into this apartment when I downsized 5 years ago, back when he still called me every Sunday, back when he still needed me. I stare at my phone, willing it to vibrate with his name, knowing it won't. The silence in this place echoes louder than the sirens on Amsterdam Avenue. Last Tuesday, I received a text message that made my heart skip. "Mom, can we talk? It's important." For a moment, hope bloomed in my chest like spring flowers after a harsh winter. I called him immediately, my fingers trembling as I pressed his number. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Then voicemail. His professional voice, confident and warm, telling callers he was building something extraordinary and would return their call soon. I left a message, trying to keep the desperation out of my voice. That was 6 days ago. You see, Michael wasn't always this way. I raised him to be honest, to value family above all else. When his father left us when Michael was 8, it was just the 2 of us in a walk-up apartment in Queens. I worked double shifts at the diner on Northern Boulevard, my feet aching in those white nursing shoes, serving coffee and dreams to truck drivers and insomniacs. Every tip, every overtime hour, every penny I could scrape together went toward giving Michael opportunities I never had. I remember his first day at Columbia University. We took the subway together from Queens, my hands shaking as I carried the single suitcase containing everything he owned. He looked so young, so full of dreams, standing there in the shadow of those imposing buildings. I had sold my mother's engagement ring to pay for his first semester, the diamond catching light one last time before disappearing into someone else's life. When I hugged him goodbye, he whispered, "I'm going to make you proud, Mom. I'm going to build something amazing." For years, he did make me proud. Michael excelled at everything: academics, internships, networking. He graduated summa cum laude with a degree in business administration, and I sat in the audience at his graduation ceremony, tears streaming down my face as he walked across that stage. I was the only family member there, but I cheered loud enough for an entire clan. That night, over dinner at a small Italian restaurant near campus, he held my hands across the table and said, "Everything I become, I owe to you." Those words felt like a promise. They felt like a covenant between mother and son. After graduation, Michael moved to Chicago to start his career. The distance felt manageable at first. Phone calls twice a week, visits every few months, constant updates about his progress in the finance world. He started as an analyst at a mid-sized investment firm, working 80-hour weeks and living in a studio apartment that made my current place look spacious. But he had vision, he had drive, and he had dreams that seemed to grow larger each time we spoke. "I'm learning everything about the stock market, Mom," he would tell me during our Sunday calls. Stocks, bonds, cryptocurrency, all of it. The money these guys make is incredible. One day, I'm going to have my own firm. I'm going to build an empire based on honor and truth. Honor and truth. Those words became his mantra, his mission statement, his identity. He would repeat them in every conversation, in every email, in every rare visit home. "Honor and truth, Mom. That's what separates me from all the greedy jerks on Wall Street. By his late 20s, Michael had saved enough money to make his first real investment. He called me, excited as a child on Christmas morning, to tell me he had purchased his first stocks with his own capital. "I made $3,000 in 1 week, Mom. Can you believe it? $3,000 just from being smart about the market." I was so proud. My son, the little boy I had raised on waitress tips and food stamps, was making real money in the world of high finance. When he told me he was ready to leave his job and start his own investment consulting firm, I supported him completely. When he asked if I could help with the initial capital, just a small loan to get started, I didn't hesitate. It started with $5,000, my entire Christmas bonus from the department store where I had taken a part-time job after the diner closed down. "Just a loan, Mom. I'll pay you back with interest." He had prepared documents, professional-looking papers with letterhead and signatures. He explained how client investments worked, how he would earn fees for managing portfolios, how the money would grow exponentially once word spread about his success. The $5,000 became $10,000 when he needed to lease office space in downtown Chicago, then $15,000 for equipment and software, then $25,000 when he landed his first major client and needed to show financial stability. Each time, Michael presented detailed business plans, charts showing projected returns, testimonials from satisfied clients. Each time he promised to pay me back as soon as the next quarterly reports come in. I had worked my entire adult life and saved carefully. Even as a single mother working multiple jobs, I managed to put away small amounts each month. By the time I was ready to retire, I had accumulated nearly $200,000 in savings and investments. Not a fortune, but enough to live modestly and maintain my independence. My financial advisor, a kind man named Robert, who had helped me navigate the complexities of retirement planning, always told me the same thing. "Eleanor, this money represents your security. Never risk more than you can afford to lose." But this wasn't risk. This was family. This was my son, my only child, the person I loved most in the world. When he needed help, how could I refuse? The requests became more frequent. "Mom, I need $50,000 to expand the client base." "Mom, there's an incredible opportunity in Bitcoin, but I need capital fast." "Mom, my biggest client just doubled their investment, but I need to show matching funds to maintain credibility." Each explanation sounded reasonable, professional, urgent. Each transaction was temporary, just until the next wave of profits came through. By 18 months into his venture, I had transferred nearly all of my savings to various accounts associated with Michael's business. He had renamed his firm Hartwell & Associates, using our family name to establish credibility. He sent me glossy brochures showing impressive office spaces, professional headshots of himself in expensive suits, testimonials from clients praising his integrity and results. "Honor and truth," he would tell me during our increasingly brief phone conversations. "That's what Hartwell & Associates represents. We're not like those other firms that cut corners or deceive clients. We build wealth the right way." I trusted him completely. Why wouldn't I? He was my son, my greatest achievement, my legacy in this world. When friends at the senior center asked about my finances, I would beam with pride as I explained how my successful son was managing my investments, earning returns I never could have achieved on my own. "He's built this incredible business from nothing," I would tell anyone who would listen. "Honor and truth, that's his motto." But as months passed, something began to change in our relationship. Michael's calls became shorter, more infrequent, more focused on business than personal connection. When I asked about visiting Chicago to see his office, he always had excuses: renovations, client meetings, important presentations. When I suggested he visit New York, he was too busy building the firm, too focused on securing new clients, too committed to growing his empire. The first crack in my trust appeared on a cold February morning. I had been feeling unwell for several days, a persistent cough and fever that wouldn't break. I called Michael, hoping to hear his voice, maybe get some sympathy and comfort. The phone went straight to voicemail. I tried again the next day. Voicemail. The third day, when I finally reached him, he sounded distracted, impatient. "Mom, I'm in the middle of something huge here. Can this wait? I've got 3 client calls this afternoon. I just wanted to talk to you, honey. I've been sick. That's too bad. Listen, take some medicine or whatever. I really can't talk right now. The line went dead before I could respond. I stared at my phone, trying to process what had just happened. This wasn't the Michael I knew. The son who used to call me when he had nightmares, who brought me flowers on Mother's Day, who credited me with everything good in his life. This was a stranger wearing my son's voice. My 71st birthday came and went without a card, a call, or even a text message. I sat alone in my apartment that evening, looking at the small cake I had bought for myself at the grocery store, trying to understand how the most important person in my life could forget the woman who gave him life. When I called him 2 days later to mention it, he seemed genuinely surprised. "Oh God, Mom, I'm so sorry. Things have been absolutely insane here. The business is exploding. We're managing millions of dollars in client assets now. I'll make it up to you, I promise. Millions of dollars. The number should have made me proud, but instead, it made me uncomfortable. If his business was managing millions, why was he still asking me for financial help? When I raised this question delicately, Michael's tone shifted to something I had never heard before. Defensive, almost aggressive. "Mom, you don't understand how this industry works. Client money and operating capital are completely separate things. Just because we manage investments doesn't mean we have cash flow for operations. That's why your support is so crucial. You're not just helping me, you're helping all of our clients build secure futures." He made it sound noble, even patriotic. I was contributing to the financial security of hardworking families across the Midwest. I was part of something bigger than myself, something built on honor and truth. The doubt that had been growing in my mind retreated, replaced once again by pride in my son's success. But the distance between us continued to grow. Christmas came and went with a brief phone call and a generic gift card sent through the mail. My calls increasingly went to voicemail. When we did speak, Michael seemed distracted, always rushing to end the conversation. The warm, loving son who used to tell me about his dreams, his fears, his girlfriends, had been replaced by someone who spoke only in business jargon and financial projections. Then came the day that changed everything. It was a Thursday in March, one of those gray New York mornings when winter refuses to release its grip on the city. I had gone to Chase Bank on 82nd Street to resolve a simple issue with my checking account, a missing deposit confirmation that my Social Security caseworker needed for some paperwork. I expected to be in and out in 10 minutes. Instead, I found myself sitting across from a young bank representative named Jessica, her face marked by an expression I couldn't quite read. Professional concern mixed with something that looked uncomfortably like pity. "Mrs. Hartwell, I'm looking at your account history, and I need to ask you some questions about these large transfers over the past 2 years." "Transfers?" "Yes, ma'am. There have been numerous withdrawals, many in amounts of $20, $30, even $50,000, all going to various business accounts. The total amount is quite substantial." My heart began to race. "Those are investments. My son manages my money through his firm." Jessica nodded slowly, but her expression didn't change. "I understand. But Mrs. Hartwell, I need to show you something that concerns me." She turned her computer screen toward me, and what I saw made the room start to spin. Column after column of withdrawals, transfers, fees. Numbers that made no sense. Amounts I couldn't remember authorizing. Dates that blurred together in a pattern that looked less like managed investments and more like systematic depletion. "Mrs. Hartwell, your account balance is currently $437. $437, from nearly $200,000. I had been living month to month on my Social Security check, assuming my savings were growing under Michael's expert management. I had been rationing groceries and keeping my apartment cold to save on heating bills, all while my son was withdrawing tens of thousands of dollars from my life savings. "There must be some mistake," I whispered. But even as I said it, I knew there wasn't. Jessica printed out a detailed statement showing every transaction over the past 2 years. The paper trail was unmistakable. Systematic withdrawals, always in amounts just under the federal reporting requirements. always to accounts with official-sounding names like Hartwell Capital Management and Strategic Investment Holdings, LLC. I sat in that sterile bank office, fluorescent lights humming overhead, holding papers that documented the methodical destruction of my financial security. Each line item represented hours of work at the diner, tips counted out in quarters and crumpled dollar bills, overtime shifts when my feet screamed in pain, years of careful saving and cautious spending. In 2 years, Michael had taken it all. The walk back to my apartment felt like moving through water. Every step required enormous effort. The familiar sounds of the city, car horns, construction noise, fragments of conversations in multiple languages, seemed to come from another world. I climbed the 4 flights of stairs to my studio, each step heavier than the last. Once inside, I sat at my kitchen table and spread the bank documents across the surface like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle that I desperately didn't want to complete. But the picture was clear. My son, the child I had raised to value honesty above all else, had been systematically stealing from me while building what he called an empire based on honor and truth. I tried calling him. The phone went straight to voicemail. I tried texting. No response. I tried his office number, the one from his business cards. A cheerful recorded voice told me that Hartwell and Associates was experiencing high call volumes and to leave a detailed message for the fastest response. For 3 days, I existed in a fog of disbelief. I barely ate, barely slept, barely moved from that kitchen table where the evidence of my son's betrayal lay scattered like breadcrumbs, leading me away from everything I thought I knew about my life. The walls of my small apartment seemed to close in around me, and the silence became a living thing that pressed against my chest until I could barely breathe. On the 4th day, I did something I had never done before in all my years as Michael's mother. I got angry. Not the quick flash of irritation that comes with burned dinner or a missed appointment. This was something deeper, hotter, more dangerous. This was the rage of a woman who had given everything to someone who saw her generosity as an opportunity for exploitation. This was the fury of a mother who realized that the child she had loved unconditionally had learned to use that love as a weapon against her. I called Michael's number every hour for 6 hours straight. Each call went to voicemail. Each silence felt like another small betrayal. Finally, at 9 o'clock that evening, my phone rang. "Mom, what the hell? You've called me like 20 times. I'm in the middle of important work here." His tone was annoyed, put upon, as if I were the one behaving inappropriately. For a moment, I was so shocked by his casual dismissal that I couldn't speak. "Michael, I went to the bank this week." Silence on the other end of the line. "Michael, I saw the statements. I saw what you've been doing." More silence. "Michael, where is my money?" When he finally spoke, his voice had changed. Gone was the irritation, replaced by something smoother, more calculated. This was the voice he probably used with difficult clients, the tone designed to deflect and redirect. "Mom, I think there's been some confusion. You asked me to manage your investments. That's what I've been doing. Your money is working for you in various portfolios and market positions. Just because it's not sitting in a savings account earning 0% interest doesn't mean it's gone. Then show me. Show me the accounts, the investments, the returns you promised." "It doesn't work that way, Mom. These are complex financial instruments. You wouldn't understand the statements anyway. You have to trust me. Haven't I always been honest with you? Trust me. Haven't I always been honest with you?" The words that had once comforted me now sounded like mockery. I thought about all the times I had defended him to friends who questioned why a successful businessman needed money from his retired mother. I thought about all the sacrifices I had made, all the opportunities I had given up, all the love I had poured into raising a son who could look me in the eye and lie with such practiced ease. "Michael, I want my money back, all of it. Now." He laughed, actually laughed. "Mom, you're being ridiculous. That's not how investments work. You can't just demand immediate liquidation without losing significant value. Besides, most of that capital has already been deployed in long-term positions. It would take months to unwind everything. Then start unwinding it today. I'm not going to destroy years of careful portfolio building because you got scared looking at some bank statements you don't understand. Your money is safe, Mom. It's growing. In 5 years, you'll thank me for not letting you make this mistake. 5 years. He was asking me to wait 5 years to access my own money while I lived on Social Security in a 400-square-foot apartment in Manhattan. He was asking me to trust him for 5 more years while he continued building his empire with my life savings. Michael, I'm 72 years old. I don't have 5 years to wait for you to maybe return money that belongs to me. Don't be so dramatic, Mom. You're healthy. You could live another 20 years. Could live another 20 years. Not would, not should. Could, as if my survival were an inconvenient variable in his business plan rather than the most important consideration in any decision involving my financial security. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to sirens and late-night conversations drifting up from the street below. For the first time in my life, I truly understood what it meant to be alone. Not just physically alone, but completely isolated from anyone who cared about my well-being more than their own interests. I had given Michael everything I had to give, and he had taken it all without a second thought. The son I had raised to be honorable had become a thief. The child I had taught to tell the truth had become a master manipulator. The family I thought would be my support system in old age had become the source of my greatest vulnerability. But lying there in the darkness, something else began to grow alongside my grief and anger. Something I hadn't felt in years, maybe decades. A small, quiet voice that reminded me I was more than just Michael's mother, more than just a source of capital for his dreams. I was Eleanor Hartwell, a woman who had survived an abusive marriage, raised a child alone, worked multiple jobs to build a life from nothing. I was stronger than I had been allowing myself to be. The next morning, I did something that felt both terrifying and necessary. I opened my laptop, an old Dell that Michael had given me for my birthday 3 years earlier, and began to research. I looked up Hartwell & Associates. I searched for Michael's business registration, his professional licenses, his office address. What I found made my blood run cold. The address listed for his corporate headquarters was a UPS store in a strip mall outside Chicago. His business registration had been filed and immediately suspended for failure to maintain required documentation. There was no professional license, no regulatory oversight, no evidence that Hartwell & Associates existed as anything more than a name on a bank account. I found his social media profiles, which told a different story entirely. Photos of Michael at expensive restaurants, vacations to Costa Rica and Italy, a new BMW with temporary tags. He was living like a millionaire while telling me he needed my retirement savings to keep his business operational. The empire he claimed to be building with honor and truth was built on lies and funded by the woman who had given him life. The rage that had been simmering since my visit to the bank exploded into something consuming and clarifying. I called the police. I called the FBI. I called the Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation. In each conversation, I encountered variations of the same response. Family financial arrangements were difficult to prosecute, especially when money had been transferred voluntarily, even if under false pretenses. Ma'am, did you sign documents authorizing these transfers? Yes, I had signed documents. Documents that I thought were investment agreements but were apparently simple transfer authorizations. Ma'am, did your son explicitly promise guaranteed returns? No, he hadn't guaranteed anything. He had talked about market performance and projected growth, but he had been careful to use language that protected him legally while deceiving me practically. Ma'am, do you have evidence that the money was used for purposes other than what you intended? This question was the cruelest of all. I had intended for my money to be invested wisely to ensure my financial security. Instead, it had been used to fund my son's lifestyle while he built a fake business. But proving intent, proving fraud, proving criminal behavior rather than just family betrayal, that was a different matter entirely. After a week of phone calls and police reports that led nowhere, I realized I was on my own. The legal system that should have protected elderly victims of financial abuse was instead protecting the predators who knew how to navigate its loopholes. Michael had been careful, probably with legal advice, to structure his theft in ways that were morally reprehensible, but technically not prosecutable. I was going to have to save myself. The first step was practical. I changed my bank passwords, my online access codes, everything that might give Michael continued access to what little money I had left. I informed the bank that no one was authorized to access my accounts or receive information about my finances. I closed the joint savings account that I had opened years earlier for emergencies, the one that had given him legitimate access to transfer funds. The second step was emotional, and it was much harder. I had to accept that the Michael I thought I knew, the son I had loved unconditionally for 44 years, might never have existed at all. The charming, ambitious, grateful child might have been a performance, a role he played to maintain access to my resources and emotional support. The man who had systematically stolen my life savings while telling me about honor and truth was showing me his true character, and I had to believe what I was seeing rather than what I desperately wanted to believe. This realization felt like dying. Not the quick death of an accident or heart attack, but the slow death of watching everything you thought you knew about your most important relationship dissolve into lies and manipulation. I spent days crying, not just for my lost money, but for my lost son, for my lost illusions, for my lost sense of security in the world. But after the crying came something unexpected: relief. For years I had been making excuses for Michael's behavior, explaining away his coldness and distance, justifying his requests for money and his failure to visit or call regularly. I had been working overtime emotionally to maintain a relationship that existed primarily in my imagination. Now that I could see the truth clearly, I no longer had to carry the burden of pretending everything was fine. I was 72 years old, living on Social Security in a tiny Manhattan apartment with less than $500 to my name. But for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. My phone rang constantly for the next few days. Michael, suddenly attentive, calling to check on me and clear up any confusion about my finances. I didn't answer. His voicemails grew increasingly desperate, then angry, then threatening. He was going to straighten this out with the bank. He was going to fix the misunderstanding about his business operations. He was going to help me understand why I was being unreasonable. Each message revealed more of his true character. When charm and manipulation didn't work, he resorted to intimidation. When intimidation failed, he tried guilt. When guilt proved ineffective, he attempted to gaslight me into believing my own perceptions were wrong. It was a masterclass in psychological abuse, and recognizing it for what it was gave me the strength to continue ignoring his calls. But Michael wasn't my only problem. Word of our conflict had somehow reached other family members, and suddenly I was fielding calls from his ex-wife Laura, his half-sister Emma from his father's second marriage, even his father David, who hadn't spoken to me in over a decade. Each conversation followed a similar pattern. They were concerned about me. They had heard I was confused about Michael's business arrangements. They wanted to help me understand that I was misinterpreting normal financial management practices. Most importantly, they wanted me to know that I was damaging the family by making accusations that could hurt Michael's professional reputation. Laura was the most persistent. She called 3 times in one day, her voice dripping with false concern. "Eleanor, honey, I know you're upset, but you have to understand that Michael's business is very complex. He's managing millions of dollars for clients across the country. He can't just liquidate everything because you're having anxiety about normal investment strategies. Millions of dollars for clients across the country." The lie was so elaborate, so detailed, that part of me almost wanted to believe it, almost wanted to accept that there had been some misunderstanding, that my son really was the successful businessman he claimed to be, that my money really was safely invested rather than stolen. But I had done my research. I had seen the UPS store address and the suspended business registration. I had documented every transfer, every lie, every broken promise. I knew the truth, even when everyone else in the family preferred the fantasy. "Laura," I said during her final call, "I've seen the bank records. I know where my money went, and I know you know the truth too." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. Finally, she spoke, and for the first time her voice sounded genuine rather than manipulative. "Eleanor, even if what you're saying is true, what do you want us to do? Michael is family. We can't abandon family. Family." The word that had once been my greatest source of pride and belonging now sounded like a trap. These people were more committed to protecting a liar and a thief than to supporting the elderly woman he had victimized. They knew what Michael had done, but they were choosing to enable his behavior rather than face the uncomfortable truth about who he really was. You're right, Laura. We can't abandon family. That's why Michael should return the money he stole from his mother. She hung up on me. Over the following weeks, the family pressure intensified. Emma called to lecture me about forgiveness and moving forward for the sake of family unity. David sent a long email explaining that family conflicts should be resolved privately, not through outside authorities like banks and police. Even Michael's college roommate, someone I had barely spoken to in 20 years, called to suggest that I was overreacting to normal business practices. The message from all of them was clear. My financial security mattered less than Michael's reputation. My welfare as an elderly woman living in poverty mattered less than the family's image of success and respectability. My right to my own money mattered less than their comfort with avoiding difficult conversations about accountability and consequences. But the more they pressured me to back down, the more determined I became to stand my ground. Each phone call reminded me that these people had watched Michael take advantage of me for years without saying a word. Each lecture about family loyalty revealed their complete indifference to my well-being. Each request to let it go demonstrated their belief that I existed primarily to serve their needs rather than my own. I stopped answering calls from anyone connected to Michael. I changed my phone number and gave the new one only to the few people in my life who had shown genuine concern for my situation: my upstairs neighbor, Mrs. Chen, my doctor's office, my former coworker Rita from the department store. The silence in my apartment became different. Instead of the oppressive silence of waiting for calls that never came, it became the peaceful silence of a woman who had finally stopped begging for love and respect from people who had none to offer. I filled my days with small pleasures that I had neglected for years, while focused on Michael's needs and demands. I started walking in Central Park every morning, something I had always meant to do but never found time for when I was managing Michael's constant financial emergencies. I rediscovered the New York Public Library, spending hours reading novels and memoirs that reminded me there were other stories in the world besides my own tragedy. I began cooking real meals for myself instead of surviving on cheap convenience foods while sending hundreds of dollars at a time to support Michael's business development. Slowly, very slowly, I began to remember who I was before I became defined entirely by my role as Michael's mother and financial supporter. I was a woman who had built a life from nothing, who had survived divorce and single motherhood and decades of financial struggle. I was someone who had worked hard, saved carefully, and deserved to enjoy the security that those sacrifices had earned. But recovery wasn't linear. Some mornings I woke up convinced that I had been too harsh, that there must be some explanation for Michael's behavior that would restore our relationship and return my sense of family. Other days, anger consumed me so completely that I could barely function, rage at my own naivety, as much as at his betrayal. The worst moments came when I saw other elderly parents with their adult children, at the grocery store, in the park, on the subway. Their easy affection, their obvious mutual care and respect, reminded me of everything I had lost. Not just my money, but my illusions about motherhood, about family, about the rewards of unconditional love. 3 months after discovering the theft, I made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. I was going to Chicago. I was going to find Michael's office, see his operation firsthand, and demand the return of my money face to face. If he really was managing millions of dollars in client investments, he could afford to repay the elderly mother who had made his success possible. If he wasn't, then I would finally have incontrovertible proof of his deception. Rita offered to come with me, but I knew this was something I had to do alone. I used almost the last of my money to buy a round-trip bus ticket to Chicago, a 20-hour journey that would save me the cost of airfare but give me plenty of time to prepare for what might be my final conversation with my son. The Greyhound station in Port Authority was crowded with travelers who, like me, couldn't afford faster or more comfortable options. Families with small children, elderly people visiting relatives, young adults starting new chapters of their lives with everything they owned packed into duffel bags and backpacks. Looking around at my fellow passengers, I realized I wasn't ashamed to be traveling this way. I was 72 years old, riding a bus to confront the son who had stolen my retirement savings, and I was doing it on my own terms with my head held high. The bus pulled out of Manhattan as the sun was setting, and I watched the familiar skyline shrink in the distance. For the first time in months, I felt something that might have been hope. Not hope that Michael would suddenly become the son I had always wanted him to be, but hope that I was strong enough to handle whatever I discovered in Chicago. I had reserved one night at a budget motel near the address listed for Hartwell and Associates. The room was small and clean, with a view of a parking lot and the kind of industrial landscape that surrounds most American cities. But it was mine, paid for with my own money, what little I had left, and chosen for my own purposes. The next morning, I took a taxi to the strip mall that allegedly housed Michael's corporate headquarters. The UPS store was wedged between a nail salon and a Subway restaurant, hardly the prestigious financial district address I had imagined. I asked the teenage clerk behind the counter about Hartwell and Associates. "Oh yeah, that's just a mailbox rental," she said, barely looking up from her phone. "Some guy comes by once a week or so to pick up mail. Haven't seen him in a while, though." A mailbox rental. Michael's impressive business address was a mailbox rental in a strip mall. His corporate headquarters existed only in the fake documents he had created to convince me that my money was being professionally managed rather than stolen. I took another taxi to the office building where Michael had claimed to lease actual workspace for client meetings and investment management. The security guard in the lobby had never heard of Hartwell and Associates. The building directory showed no such company. The floor and suite number Michael had given me didn't exist. Finally, I went to the residential address I had found in the white pages, the condo where Michael actually lived when he wasn't pretending to be a successful investment manager. The building was new and expensive, far beyond what someone could afford on the legitimate income from managing a few $1,000s in family investments. I called him from the lobby. "Michael, I'm downstairs. We need to talk." The silence on the other end of the line lasted so long that I thought the call had dropped. Finally, he spoke, and his voice sounded different than it had in years. Younger, somehow. Scared. "Mom, what are you doing here?" "I'm here to see your office. I'm here to meet your clients. I'm here to get my money back. You can't just show up unannounced. I'm not prepared for visitors." "Then get prepared. I'll wait." An hour later, Michael appeared in the lobby, and the first thing I noticed was how much older he looked. Not older in years, but older in spirit. The confident young businessman who had charmed me into funding his dreams was gone, replaced by someone who looked exhausted and defeated. His expensive suit couldn't hide the weight he had lost, the shadows under his eyes, the nervous energy that made him fidget constantly with his phone and keys. We went to a coffee shop across the street, one of those generic chains that exist in every American city. Michael ordered a large coffee with 3 shots of espresso, the drink of someone running on anxiety and caffeine. I ordered tea and watched him struggle to find words that would explain away everything I had discovered. "Mom, I know this looks bad." I waited. "The business has been going through a rough patch. Some investments didn't perform as expected. Market conditions have been challenging." I continued waiting. "I was going to tell you about the temporary setbacks, but I didn't want you to worry unnecessarily. Your money is safe. It's just tied up in some complicated positions that take time to liquidate." "Michael, I went to your office address. It's a mailbox at a UPS store." His face crumbled, and for a moment, he looked like the 8-year-old boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. But I reminded myself that the scared child and the man who had stolen from me were the same person. One didn't cancel out the other. "Mom, I can explain everything." Then explain. What followed was a confession that was somehow worse than I had imagined and exactly what I had expected. There was no investment firm. There were no clients. There had never been any professional management of my money. Michael had been lying about every aspect of his life for over 2 years, using my savings to fund the lifestyle he thought a successful businessman should have, while telling himself he would eventually pay me back once he figured out how to make the fantasy real. He had spent nearly $200,000 on rent for the expensive condo, lease payments on the BMW, vacations that he documented on social media to maintain the illusion of success. meals at high-end restaurants where he supposedly entertained clients, and clothes appropriate for someone managing millions in investments. He had been living like a successful entrepreneur while his business existed only in his imagination, and his operating capital came entirely from his elderly mother's retirement savings. I thought if I looked successful enough, if I projected confidence and competence, clients would start coming to me. I thought I could build the business into something real and pay you back with interest. I never meant for it to go this far. Never meant for it to go this far. As if there had been an acceptable distance to take it, a reasonable amount to steal, a forgivable level of betrayal. As if the problem was that he had gotten carried away rather than that he had built his entire adult identity on lies and theft. Michael, where is my money now? It's mostly gone, Mom. The lifestyle was more expensive than I calculated. I kept thinking I was about to turn the corner, about to land the big client that would make everything work. But every month I had to spend more to maintain the image, and every month I fell further behind. Gone. Nearly $200,000. 4 decades of careful saving. The financial security that was supposed to carry me through old age. Gone. Spent on Michael's fantasy of being someone he wasn't. Sacrificed to his ego and his delusions about how the world worked. I looked across the table at this stranger who happened to be my son, and I realized that I felt surprisingly calm. The worst thing that could happen had happened. All my fears about losing my money, about being betrayed by the person I loved most, about finding myself alone and vulnerable in old age, they had all come true, and I was still here. I was still breathing, still thinking, still capable of deciding what to do next. Michael, I want you to know that you have killed our relationship, not damaged it, not complicated it, killed it. I will never trust you again. I will never loan you money again. I will never make excuses for your behavior again. As of right now, you are not my son. He started crying then. Loud sobs that drew stares from other coffee shop customers. Mom, please don't say that. You're all the family I have. I made a mistake, but we can fix this. We can work something out. A mistake. He called 2 years of systematic theft a mistake. He called the destruction of my financial security and our relationship a mistake. As if it were something that had happened accidentally rather than through thousands of deliberate choices to lie, steal, and betray. Michael, the only way you can even begin to repair what you've done is by returning my money immediately. All of it. I can't do that, Mom. It's gone. I told you, I spent it trying to build the business. I don't have access to that kind of money anymore. Then sell the condo. Sell the car! Get a job and start paying me back! The condo isn't even mine. I've been renting it. The car lease is underwater. I don't actually own anything that would generate significant value. Of course he didn't. Michael had been so committed to looking successful that he had never bothered to build actual wealth or assets. He had spent my life savings on the appearance of prosperity while creating nothing of lasting value. Then you'll work for the rest of your life to pay me back. You'll get whatever job you can find and send me every dollar you can spare until my money is returned with interest. Mom, be reasonable. Even if I could find a decent job, it would take decades to pay back that much money. I'm 44 years old. I can't spend the rest of my life in debt to you. Can't spend the rest of his life in debt to me. The woman who had spent her life in service to him couldn't expect him to spend his life making amends for destroying hers. The mother who had sacrificed everything to give him opportunities couldn't ask him to sacrifice his comfort to repair the damage he had caused. I stood up from the table and looked down at Michael, still crying into his oversized coffee cup. You're right. You can't spend the rest of your life in debt to me, because I'm never going to see you again. I walked out of that coffee shop and didn't look back. Behind me, I could hear Michael calling my name, his voice cracking with desperation. But I kept walking, out of the coffee shop, down the sidewalk, toward the bus station, and away from the lie my life had become. The bus ride back to New York gave me 20 hours to process what had happened and decide what came next. I had confirmed my worst fears about Michael, but I had also discovered something unexpected about myself. I was stronger than I had known. I was capable of facing the truth, no matter how painful, and making difficult decisions about my own well-being. For years, I had defined myself primarily as Michael's mother, measuring my success by his achievements and my worth by his affection. Now I had to figure out who Eleanor Hartwell was when she wasn't enabling her son's delusions or funding his fantasies. The first thing I did after returning to New York was meet with a bankruptcy attorney. I had no illusions about recovering my stolen money through legal channels. But I needed to understand my options for managing the financial crisis Michael had created. The lawyer was kind, but realistic. Elderly victims of family financial abuse rarely see significant recovery, and the legal costs of pursuing civil remedies often exceed any potential benefits. Mrs. Hartwell, I'm sorry to say this, but your best bet is to focus on rebuilding rather than recovering. You're 72, you're healthy, and you have time to create a new financial foundation if you're willing to make some changes to your lifestyle and expectations. Some changes to my lifestyle and expectations. A polite way of saying that I would be working and worrying about money for the rest of my life, instead of enjoying the retirement I had earned through decades of careful planning and sacrifice. But even as I absorbed this harsh reality, I felt something that surprised me: relief. For 2 years, I had been anxious about Michael's business, confused by his explanations, excluded from decisions about my own money. Now, at least, I knew where I stood. I had almost nothing, but what little I had belonged to me completely. I could make my own financial decisions, even if those decisions were constrained by very limited resources. I applied for a part-time job at the public library near my apartment. The pay was minimal, but the work was pleasant and the schedule flexible. I qualified for additional assistance programs for low-income seniors, help with utilities, transportation, food costs. The social worker who helped me navigate these applications was matter-of-fact about my situation. Mrs. Hartwell, you're not the first person I've seen whose adult children took advantage of their resources. Unfortunately, you probably won't be the last. The good news is that you caught it when you did, and you're taking active steps to rebuild. A lot of people in your situation just give up. Give up. For weeks after my trip to Chicago, giving up had seemed like the most reasonable response to my situation. I was too old to start over, too poor to live independently, too betrayed to trust anyone again. Some mornings the weight of my circumstances felt too heavy to carry, but gradually, as I settled into my new routine, work at the library 3 days a week, careful management of my small income, simple pleasures that cost little or nothing, I began to rediscover parts of myself that had been dormant for years. I remembered that I enjoyed helping people find books and information. I remembered that I was good at organizing and problem-solving. I remembered that there were aspects of life beyond financial security and family relationships that could bring satisfaction and joy. The library patrons became a kind of surrogate family, people who appreciated my help and treated me with respect and kindness. Mrs. Chen, my upstairs neighbor, started inviting me for tea and conversations that ranged from neighborhood gossip to philosophy. Rita from the department store called regularly to check on me and share stories from her own complicated relationship with her adult children. 6 months after my confrontation with Michael, I realized that I was sleeping better than I had in years. Not because my circumstances were better. I was still living paycheck to paycheck in a tiny apartment. But because I wasn't constantly anxious about Michael's next financial emergency or confused by his contradictory explanations about my investments. My phone no longer rang with desperate middle-of-the-night calls about urgent business opportunities or market crises that required immediate capital infusions. I no longer spent hours every week researching financial terms and investment strategies to try to understand what Michael was supposedly doing with my money. I no longer had to choose between paying my own bills and supporting my son's lifestyle while telling myself that his success was worth my sacrifice. The emotional space that had been occupied by worry, confusion, and enabling was gradually filled with other things. I started reading fiction again, something I had abandoned years earlier when my free time was consumed by Michael's demands. I took long walks through different neighborhoods in Manhattan, rediscovering a city I had lived in for decades but rarely explored. I began cooking elaborate meals for myself, something that had seemed pointless when I was eating alone while sending money to support Michael's expensive restaurant habits. But the hardest part of my recovery wasn't financial or practical. It was emotional. Learning to live without the dream of Michael's love and respect accepting that the relationship I had treasured most in my life had been largely one-sided, acknowledging that the son I had raised had become someone capable of destroying his mother's security without apparent remorse. Some evenings, the loneliness felt overwhelming. Not just the loneliness of living alone, but the loneliness of realizing that the person I had loved most consistently and completely had never really loved me back. Michael had valued what I could provide: emotional support, financial resources, unconditional acceptance. But he had never valued me as a person with my own needs, rights, and worth. The worst moments came when I saw news about Michael on social media. Despite everything, I hadn't been able to bring myself to block him completely, and occasionally I glimpsed posts that showed he was continuing to present himself as a successful entrepreneur. Photos of business meetings that were probably job interviews, motivational quotes about perseverance and integrity, sharing of articles about market trends and investment strategies. Each post reminded me that Michael felt no shame about what he had done to me. He wasn't hiding in disgrace or working to make amends. He was continuing to build his image as a professional and ethical businessman, while the woman who had made his lifestyle possible lived in poverty. He was still lying, still manipulating, still prioritizing his ego over any sense of responsibility or accountability. But as months passed, even these painful reminders began to lose their power to hurt me. Michael's social media presence looked increasingly desperate and fake as his financial situation presumably deteriorated. Without my money to fund his expensive lifestyle, he couldn't maintain the appearance that had never been backed by substance. His posts became less frequent, his photos less impressive, his claims about business success more obviously exaggerated. More importantly, I began to understand that Michael's behavior reflected his character, not my worth. I had been a loving, supportive, generous mother, and he had chosen to exploit those qualities rather than appreciate them. His inability to treat me with respect and honesty said nothing about my value as a person and everything about his moral emptiness. 8 months after cutting contact with Michael, something unexpected happened. I received a call from an unknown Chicago number that I almost didn't answer. When I finally picked up, the voice on the other end was familiar, but changed. "Mom? It's Michael." I should have hung up immediately, but something in his tone kept me on the line. He sounded different. Not the confident entrepreneur or the desperate manipulator, but something closer to the scared child I remembered from decades earlier. "Mom, I need to tell you something. I'm in trouble." "Michael, I told you." "No, Mom, please listen. I got arrested. Financial crimes. There were other people, other families I took money from. They were more persistent about pressing charges than you were. Other people. Other families." I had thought Michael's theft was personal, a betrayal specific to our relationship. Instead, it had been a pattern, a business model based on exploiting trust and stealing from people who couldn't afford to lose their savings. "Mom, I'm looking at prison time. Real prison time. My lawyer says if I can show restitution to all the victims, it might help with sentencing. But I don't have the money to pay everyone back." Of course he didn't have the money. He had never had the money. That was the point. Michael had been stealing from multiple victims to fund the lifestyle that was supposed to convince new victims to trust him with their savings. It was a Ponzi scheme built on family relationships and social manipulation rather than fake investment returns. "Michael, why are you calling me?" Because I need you to know that what I did to you was the worst thing I've ever done. Not because you were the biggest victim, but because you were my mother. You loved me unconditionally, and I used that love to justify stealing from you. I told myself it wasn't really theft, because I was family, because I intended to pay you back, because you would want to help me succeed. He was crying again, but this time it sounded different. Not the manipulative tears of someone trying to avoid consequences, but the genuine grief of someone who had finally understood the magnitude of what he had destroyed. "Mom, I know you'll never forgive me. I know I killed our relationship and I can never fix it. But I need you to know that I understand now. What I did was unforgivable. You were a perfect mother, and I was a terrible son. I'm sorry." The line went quiet except for the sound of his crying. For a moment, I felt something that might have been the beginning of forgiveness. Not because Michael deserved it, but because carrying anger was exhausting, and I was tired of being defined by what he had taken from me. But then I remembered the nights I had lain awake worrying about paying rent while he was spending my money on vacations. I remembered the calls from other family members telling me I was being unreasonable for wanting my own money back. I remembered the months of lies, manipulation, and gaslighting that had made me question my own perception of reality. Michael, I appreciate your apology, but an apology doesn't restore my financial security or undo the damage you caused. You're sorry because you got caught and you're facing consequences. If you were truly remorseful, you would have confessed and started making amends before you were arrested. You're right, Mom. You're absolutely right. I'm selfish, even in my apologies. Michael, I hope you get the help you need in prison. I hope you learn to become someone better than you've been, but I won't be part of that process. Our relationship is over. I know, I wanted you to hear me say that you were right about everything. You deserved better. You deserved a son who appreciated what you sacrificed for him instead of someone who saw your love as an opportunity for exploitation. I hung up the phone and sat in my quiet apartment, processing emotions I couldn't quite name. Sadness for the mother I had been, who had poured everything into raising a child who became her destroyer. Relief that Michael was finally facing consequences for his actions, even if those consequences wouldn't restore my financial security. Grief for the relationship that might have been, if Michael had chosen to become the honorable man I had tried to raise, instead of the predator he had revealed himself to be. But underneath all those complex emotions, I felt something simpler and more valuable than I had expected. Peace. Not the peace of resolution or reconciliation, but the peace of finally being free from a relationship that had been slowly destroying me for years. That evening, I did something I hadn't done since childhood. I drew myself a bath. A real bath, with hot water and bath salts I splurged on at the drugstore, and I soaked in the tub while reading a mystery novel. For an hour, I existed purely for my own pleasure, thinking about fictional characters and imaginary crimes instead of real betrayals and actual losses. When I finally got out of the tub, I looked at myself in the bathroom mirror. The woman staring back at me looked older than I remembered, marked by the stress and heartbreak of the past 2 years. But she also looked stronger, more solid, more present in her own life. I was 73 years old, living in a 400-square-foot apartment on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, working part-time at the public library for $10 an hour. I had less than $2,000 in savings and no prospect of the comfortable retirement I had planned and saved for. By most measures, Michael had succeeded in destroying the life I had built, but he hadn't destroyed me. I was still Eleanor Hartwell, still capable of making my own decisions, still worthy of respect and care. I could still find joy in small things. A good book, a sunny morning, a conversation with a friend. I could still contribute to my community through my work and my relationships. I could still choose how to spend my remaining years, even if my choices were more constrained than I had expected. Over the following months, I gradually built a life that was smaller than what I had planned, but more honest than what I had been living. I made peace with working into my 70s, finding satisfaction in helping library patrons and contributing to my community. I developed friendships with coworkers and neighbors that were based on mutual respect rather than financial dependence. I discovered interests and hobbies that I had neglected while focused on Michael's supposed needs and endless crises. Most importantly, I learned to value my own company. For decades, I had structured my life around other people. First, my abusive ex-husband, then Michael, then the imaginary future Michael who would someday appreciate my sacrifices. Now, for the first time in my adult life, I was living entirely for myself. Some people might see this as selfish or sad, but I experienced it as liberation. I could eat what I wanted, when I wanted. I could spend my free time reading, walking, thinking, or doing nothing at all. I could make financial decisions based on my own needs rather than someone else's demands. I could go to bed at night knowing that I hadn't spent the day enabling someone else's destructive behavior or compromising my own values to maintain a relationship that was harmful to my well-being. A year after Michael's arrest, he was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison for wire fraud and conspiracy. I received an unexpected piece of mail, A check from the Federal Restitution Fund, representing a small percentage of what Michael had stolen from me and his other victims. The amount was tiny compared to my losses, but it felt symbolically important. Official acknowledgement that I had been wronged, that my claims weren't just family drama, but actual financial crimes. I used the money to take my first vacation in over a decade, a week-long trip to Vermont, where I stayed in a small bed and breakfast and spent my days hiking mountain trails and reading in front of fireplaces. It was a gentle, solitary vacation, exactly what I needed to mark the end of one chapter in my life and the beginning of another. On the last evening of my trip, I sat on the inn's front porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. For the first time in years, maybe decades, I felt genuinely content. Not happy in the way I had imagined happiness during the difficult years of single motherhood and financial struggle, but content in a deeper, quieter way. I was an elderly woman of modest means living a simple life in one of the most expensive cities in the world. I would probably never own property again, never travel extensively, never experience the financial security I had worked so hard to achieve. But I was free from the emotional manipulation and financial exploitation that had defined my relationship with Michael. I was free from the constant anxiety about his next crisis or demand. I was free to discover who Eleanor Hartwell was when she wasn't defined entirely by her role as someone's mother. The mountains in front of me had existed for millions of years and would continue long after I was gone. My problems with Michael, which had seemed so overwhelming and permanent, were really just a small chapter in a much larger story. This realization didn't minimize the pain he had caused or the impact of his theft on my life, but it put those experiences in perspective. I had survived divorce, single motherhood, financial hardship, and the betrayal of my only child. I was still here, still capable of finding beauty in a Vermont sunset, still able to appreciate the kindness of strangers and the satisfaction of work well done. Whatever came next, I would face it with the knowledge that I was stronger and more resilient than I had ever imagined. When I returned to New York, I made one final decision about my relationship with Michael. I wrote him a letter, not to resume contact, but to officially end it. I told him that I forgave him, not for his sake, but for mine, because carrying anger was too heavy a burden for someone my age. I told him that forgiveness didn't mean reconciliation, that understanding his psychology didn't excuse his behavior, that wishing him well didn't mean welcoming him back into my life. I mailed the letter without including a return address. It was a gift I gave to myself, the gift of final closure, of having the last word, of ending our relationship on my terms rather than his. Then I settled into the life I had built from the ruins of the life he had destroyed. It wasn't the life I had planned, but it was mine. Every morning, I woke up in my small apartment and made coffee in my chipped mug, grateful for the solitude and the silence. Every day I went to work at the library, helping people find information and resources, contributing something valuable to my community. Every evening, I came home and spent my time exactly as I chose, reading, cooking, watching old movies, calling friends, or simply sitting quietly and appreciating the peace. On my 75th birthday, Mrs. Chen knocked on my door with a small cake she had baked herself. We sat at my kitchen table eating cake and talking about everything and nothing: the weather, the neighborhood, books we had read, places we had traveled decades earlier. It was a perfect birthday celebration, simple and genuine and free from the complicated emotions that had marked birthdays during the years I spent waiting for Michael to remember me. That night, as I prepared for bed, I thought about the 3 women I had been in my lifetime. The young wife and mother who had sacrificed everything for her family, the middle-aged single mother who had worked multiple jobs to create opportunities for her son, and the elderly woman who had learned to value her own worth and create her own happiness. Each version of Eleanor had been necessary, but this final version might be the best. Free from the expectations and obligations that had defined my earlier life, I was discovering aspects of my personality that had been suppressed for decades. I was funnier than I had remembered, more curious, more capable of finding joy in unexpected places. I fell asleep that night thinking about tomorrow's shift at the library, about the mystery novel I was halfway through reading, about the farmer's market I wanted to visit on Saturday morning. Simple pleasures, but they belonged entirely to me. The next morning brought a surprise. A call from Rita, who I hadn't heard from in several months. Her voice was excited, almost breathless. "Eleanor, you're never going to believe what I just heard on the news." Michael's story had made the local Chicago television stations. A follow-up report on white-collar crime, featuring interviews with several of his victims and their families. Rita had recognized his name from our conversations and watched the entire segment. "Eleanor, they talked about how he stole from his own mother to fund his lifestyle. They called it one of the most heartless aspects of his criminal behavior. The reporter said you were the victim who had been most completely betrayed." Most completely betrayed. The phrase should have hurt, but instead it felt validating. Official recognition that what Michael had done to me was particularly cruel. Not just garden-variety financial fraud, but something that violated the most basic expectations of family relationship. But Eleanor, that's not the best part. They interviewed some expert, some psychologist who works with elder abuse cases. She said that victims like you, who find the strength to cut contact and rebuild their lives, often end up happier and more fulfilled than they were before the abuse started. She said learning to prioritize your own needs after decades of putting family first can be incredibly empowering for women your age. More fulfilled than before. The idea seemed impossible, but as I thought about it, I realized it might be true. The years I had spent worried about Michael, confused by his explanations, and gradually isolated from friends and activities while focusing on his needs, had not been happy years. The financial security I had lost was real and significant, but the emotional freedom I had gained was also valuable. That weekend, I did something that would have been impossible during the years when Michael's crises consumed all my attention and resources. I volunteered to help with the library's annual book sale, spending Saturday mornings sorting donated books and chatting with other volunteers. In the afternoon, I attended a lecture at the community center about urban gardening, something I had always been interested in, but never had time to pursue. On Sunday, I visited the Museum of Natural History, using my senior discount to spend hours wandering through exhibits I hadn't seen since Michael was a child. It was a full, rich weekend that cost almost nothing but fed my mind and spirit in ways that my old life of constant anxiety and financial strain never had. As I walked home through Central Park on Sunday evening, I realized that Rita and the expert on television were right. Despite everything Michael had stolen from me, I was happier now than I had been in years. Not happy in a shallow, everything is perfect way, but happy in the deeper sense of being aligned with my own values, living authentically, making choices based on my own needs and desires rather than someone else's manipulation. The Eleanor who had spent her 70s worrying about Michael's finances and making excuses for his behavior had been a diminished version of myself. The Eleanor who was learning to live independently, work meaningfully, and find joy in simple pleasures was discovering capabilities and interests she had forgotten she possessed. 6 months later, I received news that provided the final closure to the Michael chapter of my life. He had been released early from federal prison for good behavior and cooperation, with ongoing investigations into financial fraud. He was required to complete his sentence in a halfway house and continue making restitution payments to his victims. But he was essentially free. The news should have upset me, but instead I felt nothing. No anger at his early release, no hope for reconciliation, no fear that he might contact me or cause further problems. Michael had become irrelevant to my life, someone who had caused me great harm in the past, but had no power to affect my present or future. I was 76 years old, working part-time, living in a tiny apartment, and struggling financially every month. By the standards I had once used to measure success, my life was a failure. But by the standards I had learned to value, autonomy, authenticity, peace, genuine relationships, meaningful work, my life was successful in ways I never could have imagined during the years when I defined myself primarily through Michael's achievements. That summer, I made a decision that surprised even me. I applied to audit a creative writing class at a nearby community college. I had always enjoyed writing, but it had been something I did privately, in journals and letters, never something I considered seriously as a form of expression or potential source of satisfaction. The class was full of people much younger than me, but also a few other seniors who, like me, were discovering interests they had set aside during decades of career and family responsibilities. Our teacher, a published novelist in her 50s, created an environment where everyone's voice was valued and heard. For the first time in my adult life, I began writing stories. Not about Michael or financial betrayal or family trauma, but about the woman I had been before motherhood, about places I had visited decades earlier, about dreams I had harbored and adventures I had imagined. Writing became a way of reclaiming parts of myself that had been buried under years of responsibility and sacrifice. My classmates were encouraging and supportive, offering feedback that helped me improve my craft while celebrating the unique perspective I brought as the oldest member of our group. Several of them became genuine friends, people who valued my company and conversation rather than my ability to solve their problems or fund their dreams. As I write this, I am 78 years old. Michael has been out of prison for over a year, and as far as I know, he is attempting to rebuild his life somewhere in the Midwest. I hope he has learned from his experiences and found ways to contribute positively to the world, but his journey is no longer my concern. I still work at the library 2 days a week, still live in my small apartment, still manage my money carefully each month. But I also write regularly, maintain friendships that enrich my life, volunteer for causes I care about, and wake up each morning eager to see what the day will bring. The money Michael stole from me is gone forever, and I will never recover the financial security I had planned for my retirement. But in destroying the life I thought I wanted, he accidentally forced me to create a life that turned out to be more meaningful and satisfying than anything I had previously imagined. I learned that love without respect is not really love at all. I learned that family relationships based on obligation and guilt are toxic to everyone involved. I learned that starting over at any age is possible if you're willing to let go of expectations that no longer serve you. Most importantly, I learned that I am enough. Not as someone's mother, not as someone's financial support system, not as someone's excuse maker or enabler, but as Eleanor Hartwell, a woman with her own interests, capabilities, and value. The sun is setting outside my window as I finish writing this story. The same window where I once stood waiting for phone calls that never came, hoping for love that was never real, enabling behavior that was slowly destroying us both. Now I look out that window and see possibility rather than disappointment, tomorrow rather than yesterday, a future that belongs entirely to me. If you've listened to this story and recognized something familiar in it, please know that you are not alone. Elder financial abuse is disturbingly common, and family-based exploitation is often the most devastating because it combines material harm with emotional betrayal. But also know that recovery is possible, that starting over is an option at any age, that you deserve better than relationships that diminish your worth or compromise your security. The most valuable thing Michael stole from me wasn't money. It was years of my life that I spent focused on his needs instead of my own. Years when I could have been discovering my own interests, building genuine friendships, creating authentic happiness instead of the artificial satisfaction that comes from enabling someone else's dreams. Don't make my mistake. Don't sacrifice your own well-being for people who see your love as a resource to be exploited rather than a gift to be treasured. Don't wait until crisis forces change. Choose change while you still have time to enjoy the benefits of living authentically. Have you ever experienced something similar to what I've shared today? Have you known someone who systematically took advantage of a family member's generosity and love? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to help me reach others who might need to hear that they're not alone, that they deserve better, and that it's never too late to choose yourself. Thank you for listening to my truth.